everybody. So as you know, we've been at BUV, we've been allowed to invite guest researchers to our department, and I invited mine. And he will give a talk today. Claudia is joking.
Oh.
So I'll give you. Should we? We were just interviewed for the web page.
Yeah.
Yes, and we were asked to tell how come we ended up working together.
Yeah.
And so we do. Some of you know this, some of you do not. We do research about the ethnic identity, and Moin was doing research at Gothenburg University with the Grey Group. We have 2 members here today. And I started a postdoc, and that's how we met.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been working together.
Yeah.
Oh, that is
Locked out.
possible. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
We just start. Maybe I'll just.
Yeah, I can stand over there. So, welcome, Moin.
Yes,
and thank you for being here. And I'll leave it to you to
Okay.
tell who you are.
Sounds good. So I'm Moin Syed. I always tell people how to pronounce my name whenever they listen. Some of you might be able to do it for me who've heard it before. I don't know if you two have heard it before. I have a handy mnemonic about how to pronounce my name. Moin is like coin with an M, Moin coin. Syed like psychology educator. Syed. That's how you pronounce it. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. This is Goldie the Gopher here. It's our mascot at the University of Minnesota. It's a kind of a quirk of American universities. We always have some sort of like animal or something that represents our universities, and so that's who that is there. I want to draw your attention to this webpage here, which you can. Here. Hey,
Hey,
nice to see you.
Beyoncé.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I can just be here for an hour
Yeah, no
because
problem.
it's in a seminar, but I wanted to
That's
the
totally
camera.
fine. Yeah,
Thank
nice to see you. Yes, on the time plan, by the way, this session is scheduled for 2 hours, but I think we'll do I'll talk for a little while, and then we'll have a fika break in the middle, and then do a little bit more. You never know. I always prepare way too much and then talk about even more stuff, so I'll sort of just see how much we get through and how much time there is. This webpage here, you can write down this address. I'll have it at the end also. It's a link to a page that has all the materials from this presentation. So it's a page on the Open Science Framework that looks like this. And all the articles that I talk about of mine are linked here. And then this is a link to a PDF version of the slides. So all this is openly available. You can download it and use it however you want to. Here you just see, oh, no internet, because I turned off, well, I turned it off, that's right. But if you click on that, well, now it's gone. If you click on that, you'll have a link to all the articles that I cite of my past work on here with links if there's open access versions. So you can write that address down if you want to now, and again, it'll be there up there again at the end. So Ylva invited me to give this presentation. We talked a little bit about what it should be, and I think we felt like there might be mutual interest in both kind of a discussion about mixed methods research, about thinking about using different research methodologies, so quantitative, qualitative, and the mix of the two, but that there would also be some interest in the substantive topic of ethnicity and identity development. And so ultimately we decided to do a little bit of both. And so that's really what the presentation is today, is sort of talking, it's both about, with a pounding, it's about ethnicity and identity, but it's also about mixed methods research. And largely what I decided, if you saw the description of the presentation, it's really framed around how doing mixed methods research has made me a better researcher. That I have gained insights that I wouldn't have otherwise gleaned if I wasn't using multiple methods. And so I will give some examples of that. So there are really 3 sections of the talk. I thought these 2 background sections were necessary. First, a background on how I conceptualize identity and the role of ethnicity for identity, so that you know where I'm coming from, especially because we have all of you, even in this audience, from multiple different disciplinary backgrounds and don't necessarily think of identity the same way. So I'll briefly go over that. Then a brief overview of mixed methods research. What do I mean by that? What is it? Why is that important? I'll try to keep that, I think it's okay. Does that make you nervous? Okay. So a brief overview of mixed methods research. Won't go into a ton of detail about that, but I'm happy to answer questions. And then finally, as I said, 3 insights on identity that really came about because of my mixed methods research. And in my mind, the way we'll do this is the first 2 before Fika and then the last one after. But we'll see what actually happens. And I'm happy to entertain questions at any time. So if you can ask, raise your hand, shout out, whatever. I'm happy to be interrupted. Okay, so part 1, background on identity and ethnicity. So the starting point for me for identity research is this person. Who is this?
Erickson.
Yes, this is Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson was referred to by his biographer as identity's architect. He's really the psychologist or really main intellectual figure who really started talking about identity and the relation between identity and development, identity and society. And despite the fact that his writings are getting quite old at this point, a lot of what he had to say was quite relevant to the work that we're doing now. And so a lot of contemporary research in psychology is really rooted in Erikson's ideas about identity development, although they've been expanded in many different ways. Some people are more familiar with this version of Erikson, these are his 8 fundamental psychosocial tensions. And I won't go into great detail about this, just to say that he essentially defined development across the lifespan as consisting of these 8 psychosocial tensions, these balances that we have to navigate. And importantly, each one of these sort of emerges at a different point in development, which you can see across the bottom, but they never really go away. So at the beginning, we have trust versus mistrust, but of course, trust issues continue throughout our lifespan, right? So even though developing a sense of sort of security and reliability of our environments is a fundamental aspect of infancy, we need to maintain that sense of trust throughout our lives. And for Erikson, it was important to have a successful resolution of each one of these tensions before you could have a successful resolution of the next tension. So they sort of build upon each other. And then so here you can see in the middle, right at adolescence, is this tension between identity and identity confusion. So from Erikson's perspective, it's really at the beginning of adolescence that young people start to think about, who am I? How do I fit into this world? What am I going to do with myself? But it's not to say there is no identity work before. There are identity issues that come up earlier, and young children are certainly wrestling with identity. And identity continues to be important throughout adulthood. But it's really centered in adolescence and emerging adulthood, young adulthood. And really, Erikson's theory should look more like this, with these continuous arrows, that these 8 tensions exist at all points of the lifespan. But at different points, certain ones take center stage. So I talk about this background just because it's useful to know generally how we see identity as really being not just a factor of who we are, but actually sort of the core of who we are. That identity, because it emerges at this time really of adolescence and into adulthood, it really lays the foundation for how we see ourselves and how we relate to other people. So it really becomes a really critical aspect of development. Now, when I read Erikson's work and subsequent empirical work, there's one word to me that stands out that's really important in terms of how to conceptualize identity, and that's integration. Now, of course, a lot of people think about integration in terms of immigrants integration, and that's one meaning of the word, but that's not really what he was talking about. Rather, integration takes different forms. So one is you have this broad idea of an identity, and one way in which we need to integrate our identities is temporal, so across past, present, and future. So the way I think about myself now should be reasonably consistent with the way I have thought about myself in the past. Or at least I'm able to make sense of how is me currently related to me 10 years ago? Or how is it related to me 20 years ago? Or do I see myself as a fundamentally different person where I make no connections? From an Eriksonian perspective, Feeling like you can't draw a straight line from the past to the present is an indication of a problematic identity. So you should have some sort of connection between the past and present. And the connection between the past and present helps you to project yourself into the future. So I extend my identity into the future. Having a sense of knowing who I am that's rooted in my history allows me to think about what I might be like down the road. Okay? So this is an important part of Ericksonian identity, that we have to have this sort of temporal integration. Another sort of form of integration is what's called contextual integration or spatial integration. And that's recognizing that this mass sort of bubble of identity actually consists of many different parts. Right? Sometimes it's not so helpful to talk about identity broadly, but specific domains. So things like roles that you might take on, like the work that you do, or being a friend, or ideologies, such as religious ideology or political ideology, or social groups, such as ethnicity and gender. So these are some examples of identity domains, and there's really no limit to how many domains you could come up with. You could think of all kinds of ones that might be important to you, that have to do with different sort of life spaces that you might occupy, or different aspects of who you are that are important. And what's really critically central to an Ericksonian perspective is that the configuration of these domains is really individually specific. That we determine, not entirely on our own, but we determine sort of which of these domains are really important to who we are. So this person here, the work domain, politics, and gender are really critical to that person. Those are the domains that that person sees as being important to who they are. Whereas for this one over here, it's religion, friendships, work, and ethnicity, right? So you take randomly select any two people, and they will highlight different identity domains that are really important. The idea from an Ericksonian perspective is from these domains, so the ones that we see are important, they must fit together in some way. We have to feel like they're integrated in some way. Now, it doesn't mean you have to feel like you're exactly the same person across all different contexts. Right? But the different aspects of who we are sort of make sense with one another, or at least aren't actively in conflict with one another. Right? So if my religious beliefs were really important to me, and they really conflicted with the work that I was engaging in, that could potentially cause some sort of psychosocial tension that then has to be dealt with in some way. Right? This is the Erickson's ideas. And this is largely, Erickson was writing about this in the 1940s and the 1950s, and these ideas have largely been supported by subsequent empirical work. That the idea that having different domains of the self in conflict with one another is not psychosocially helpful or healthy. Okay. So my particular interest has been in this domain, the ethnic domain, to think about how individuals conceptualize their ethnicity and how it's related to their identities. And what we found through some of this work, and this is true for any identity domain, is that most people have one domain that's sort of the central domain. It's sort of the center of their identities that are related to all other aspects. So what that would look like here is, for this individual, their ethnic identity is their core sort of way of seeing themselves. And therefore, it spills over into all these other domains. So to the point where maybe some of these other domains are really defined in relation to their ethnic identities. And this kind of way of seeing the self, you tend to see more often in the US with ethnic minority individuals. So those who come from non-white European backgrounds, those who are in the minority in the US, tend to have a stronger ethnic identity, and it tends to sort of permeate other aspects of who they are. So it's a central sort of core. Yeah, of course.
This core domain, or what do you call it,
Yeah.
can it change over time? So,
Yes.
Okay.
It does change over time, absolutely. So now I should say there aren't a lot of good longitudinal studies that start in adolescence and go into adulthood that really assess this very well. But you can see the emergence, some longitudinal studies, you see sort of the emergence of certain domains. So, for example, we have one study where with 18-year-olds of ethnic minority background, many of them aren't even talking about ethnicity at all. It's not important to who they are. But by the time they're 22, 23, they become central. and really important because they've had a lot of subsequent experiences that made them think about their ethnicities. We've seen with gender, at least in the American samples, that gender tends to be sort of downplayed a little bit in adolescence and early young adulthood, so the early 20s. But by the mid-20s and late 20s, early 30s, then gender starts to become more central to how people define themselves, women in particular, those who identify as non-binary or whatnot, those who are more marginalized. So they seem to have some different time scales depending on where. So politics is another one. Again, in the US, this is where it might be different in Sweden. There's really not a lot of interest in politics amongst young people. I don't know about here if there is. It's always a concern in the US that young people don't care. You know, they don't vote, they're not interested, they're disengaged. And it's not until later that they really start to develop a political identity as being really important to who they are. And the argument for both politics and gender for why those emerge a little bit later is that they're harder, especially politics. You don't need to care about politics, or doesn't seem like you need to care about it until you're sort of in adult roles, until you're working, paying taxes, worried about childcare, you know, the kinds of things that politics really play a role in directly. And excuse me, some have argued that that's true for gender in the US as well, that there's so much emphasis on sort of equality and the fact that men and women are the same. You know, there's a lot of discussion about sameness, that it's not until sort of leaving the educational world and going into the work world where women in particular realize that things are not the same, right? So there's disparities in treatment and work in the workplace and things like that, yeah.
But it has to do with context as well,
Mhm.
right? So,
Yeah.
because I think we can see in some of our narratives
Right.
that ethnic identity is not central at all until they move to another country,
Yeah.
and suddenly it's the most central part of
Yeah.
who they are.
Yeah,
Yeah, that definitely.
yeah. Along those same lines, you can move to another country where ethnicity is seen as an important variable,
Yeah.
where you're constantly asked about your ethnicity.
Right.
Or you can move to a country, you know, as a person who's moving a lot, I can
Yeah.
tell you that you can move to a country where that's not what you're asked, so it
Yeah.
still stays as a
That's right.
non-central part
Right.
of your identity. So it's not just
Yeah.
the
Not just
past,
temporal.
present,
No, it's not.
and future, but yeah, context.
Absolutely, yeah. There's, that occurs both, at least again, within the US. I haven't seen this in any of the Swedish data talked about as much, but especially because the country is so large and people move quite a bit, moving from more rural parts of the country to more urban parts of the country are often times of awareness where people all of a sudden think they hadn't thought about their ethnicity at all, even if they're from ethnic minority backgrounds, until they go to a city that's much more diverse and people start asking them questions and it's just more of a topic of conversation. So contextual shifts can happen at many different scales, but absolutely. So regarding ethnic identity, it's really important for me to define what I mean by that. For most people, both researchers, teachers, and just people in the world, they tend to equate this term ethnic identity with ethnic label. So an ethnic label are things like ones that we use quite a bit in the US, like Asian American, Mexican American, or saying Swedish or even immigrant, you know, which is more typical to use in Sweden and some other contexts. These are the labels, these are the terms that people use to describe themselves, right? And this is often equated with ethnic identity. If you're going to learn one thing from today, maybe you'll learn three things, but one of them is that this is not the case. This is not what we mean when we talk about ethnic identity. We're not talking about these labels, and sometimes that is, those two things get conflated a little bit. Rather, what we're talking about here is more the subjective or affective components, right? So how much does one identify with their ethnic group? What role does it play in their lives? How important is it to them? So it's not something that you can say, oh, those people, their ethnic identity, it's Mexican, right? That's the label. It's more about how Mexican do they feel, right? What's their Mexicanness? So it's a variable that, something that varies from very little to a lot, and many people are in the middle, right? So it's an individual difference kind of construct that has variation. And it's really important to consider this because there are a lot of studies that talk about ethnic identity, but they're really just looking at ethnic label. And sort of, there's an assumption that then everyone who identifies with one of these labels has some sort of level of homogeneity, that they think in the same way, they act in the same way, that you can learn something about their psychology by looking at their label. And it is absolutely the case in every single study that I've ever seen that looks at the predictive power of an ethnic label and ethnic identity, so you sort of put these together, which one tells us more about psychological experiences, the action's always over there, right? You always learn more through the ethnic identity than you do through the ethnic label. Another way to say this, if you do any kind of study and you compare people from different ethnic backgrounds like this, and that you see some kind of group differences, they can almost always be explained by ethnic identity. Ethnic identity has more explanatory power. Now, there's sometimes group differences are explained by other things, but it's not useful to just rely on the labels. You need to assess how important is this actually to who they are. Now, this, just like, so before I had identity as a big bubble here with lots of different parts, even once we go into these domains, specific domains such as ethnic identity, we can break that into lots of different parts as well. So there are many different ways of thinking about ethnic identity, and it is in fact a multi-dimensional construct. So just talking about how much, more or less isn't sufficient. There are actually different components of ethnic identity, different ways of thinking about it. And there are three broad families of how to think about it. One is in terms of process. These are sort of the psychological processes that people engage in that are related to their ethnic identities. And these are actually, I should say, these are not specific to ethnicity. These are really true for any identity domain from a psychological perspective. And so engaging in a process of exploration. So talking to others, attending events, reading books, whatever it might be, something that tells them, that helps them learn about their ethnic background. Right? It's a process that they engage in. Commitment has to do with sort of refining or becoming clear on the meaning of ethnicity for who they are. What role does it play in my life? Autobiographical reasoning is a specific form of reasoning about one's past. So how do I think about my past experiences around ethnicity and connect them to how I see myself? So it's really drawing that connection between the past and the present. These are broad processes and really have been the focus of much of the psychological literature, is on these kind of processes that are very general. Just how much do you engage in these? Do you do these kinds of things? In contrast, there's a focus on content. And identity content is more the sort of substance, right? The details, the context. So specific attitudes that they might hold about their ethnicities, emotions that they might have, concrete experiences, just what is their everyday lived experience around being a person of a particular ethnic background. So these are the specific contents, they're really the day-to-day details. They're more about qualitatively different kinds of phenomena versus the processes of exploration, commitment, autobiographical reasoning. They tend to be more quantitative, like engaging in more or less of these processes. You really need to put the two together. That's the most, I think, the best way to go. But it's just important to know that different researchers are talking about different components. The third one is structure. Structure is more of sort of what does the identity look like. So if you're familiar with the identity status model, this is a structural model because it incorporates sort of exploration and commitment and puts them together. So basically, if you're putting any of these sort of processes together or contents together in some sort of configuration, sort of how they fit together, then you're really talking about the structure of identity. So this is sort of really, details on the identity literature, but I like to bring these kinds of issues up because one of the major problems I have just within psychology, I know not everyone here is psychologists, just within psychology is we have so many different definitions and approaches to all these kinds of phenomena. So ethnic identity can look very different when studied by a developmental psychologist versus a social psychologist versus some cultural psychologists. So even within psychology, we don't always agree on these kinds of things. And then it gets much worse once you go into other disciplines, because we're all talking about different sort of things. And so, all of this is happening within psychology. We might all call it ethnic identity, but it's very difficult to sort of compare unless you're aware of these variations, aware of these differences and how ethnic identity is conceptualized and measured. This will be a theme I come back to. I'll give you some more concrete examples of what this looks like. One finding we know very clearly is there's this construct called positive ethnic racial affect. You can think of it as like commitment. How much do individuals identify with their group and feel like it's an important part of who they are? So it's sort of an emotional, like belongingness and emotional component. It's a meta-analysis we did a couple years ago, and we found strong evidence that this sense of positive ethnic racial affect is related to these forms of positive adjustment, so social functioning, self-esteem, and psychological well-being. I should comment, these were all US samples in this study. And the reason for that was not to be too US-centric, although we have that problem also. But there are actually very, very few studies of this type outside the US. There are some in Canada, but very few in Europe that actually are doing these kinds of analyses. So there's not a lot to really aggregate. So this is all based on American samples. So it's related to more positive adjustment, less negative adjustment, so looking at mental health kind of concerns. Yeah?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you say American samples, what do you mean by that? In my world, it's very different people.
Yes, so there is a lot of variety in who's included in these samples. These particular analyses were only with American ethnic minorities. So that would include African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. Did I forget? Asian Americans, too, yeah. Did I say that? I missed it. Yeah.
So do you only conduct quantitative studies, or have you included any qualitative
Yeah,
studies?
well, I'm going there. I'll talk more about that, yeah.
Sorry.
But this is all based on quantitative
yeah,
studies,
I guess that.
I'll show you some. This is the reason I'm showing this to you is to bridge to that point. Yeah, but the short answer to your question is the vast majority is quantitative. U.S. American psychology is still really dominated by quantitative approaches. I think. Well, I don't want to say what I think about Swedish psychology. You all can say what you think about it. But I know because it varies quite a bit by country in terms of what sort of the relative balance of quantitative and qualitative. And in the US, qualitative, it's become more accepted in psychology, but is still really seen as kind of less than. And so you don't see as much qualitative work, but it's changing slowly. I'm trying to change it. I try to do both. So yes, these are all with American ethnic minority samples. I should say there's less research on ethnic identity amongst American white populations, but it does exist, and I've done some of that work. And actually the patterns tend to look pretty similar in terms of the correlations. So the mean levels are different. If you look at mean levels of these constructs like positive ethnic racial affect, very reliably across the board, ethnic minorities will score higher mean levels than will white Americans on those. So they tend to identify more with their ethnic group. But in terms of the correlations with these kinds of outcomes, it tends to look pretty similar. There's a mean difference, but not a relational difference. And then just in a different domain, we also see with academic adjustment. So people who are identifying more with their ethnic group tend to be doing better in school, actually, as well. So there's pretty robust evidence that this tends to be a pretty good thing for young people. There are some potential risks, of course, too. I'm not going to go into details on that. But mainly I just want to show you the very quantitative heavy approach that's been here so far. One problem is, so this is a particular model that exists. I'll say more about this later. So ethnic identity is related to adjustment, as I was just showing, and that supposedly ethnic identity in part comes from the process of cultural socialization, and I'll say more about what that is later. But really it's the degree to which parents and to some extent peers engage in a process of teaching their children about their culture. So part of the reason why ethnic minorities identify more with their ethnicity is because their parents are engaging in more of this sort of active socialization to teach them about it. But one of the problems with this is just really a segue to thinking more qualitatively, is we just look at this. I showed you those different processes, those different components and everything, and I don't expect you to process this whatsoever. This is just to show you how ridiculous it is. These are two different scales of ethnic identity. These are all the different processes and measures that one could use. So there's enough here that if each of you decided to go out and do a study on ethnic identity, you could all use a different measure. You could all measure it in a different way. And that's just based on these two measures that exist. These are two measures that are out there. Again, I'm not expecting you to process any of that other than to see that it's a lot. Right? So this isn't comprehensive at all. This is just from two perspectives. There are all these different ways of conceptualizing ethnic identity. So it becomes very difficult to know what are we actually talking about here, and how do we compare across studies? How do we compare findings? And again, you're not supposed to see these, but that's also true for adjustment. There's almost infinite ways that we could define adjustment, right? And it's also true for cultural socialization. Those things can be defined in almost infinite ways. So we have all these measurement kind of issues going on in terms of like, what are we actually talking about? Which is really challenging from a research synthesis point of view. We really want to be able to understand and say something about ethnicity and ethnic identity, but when you have this much variation, it's nearly impossible to really say something. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because, again, in the context that I work in, quantitative approaches are really dominant. And I do lots of quantitative research. I'm fully quantitative at times. But quantitative research is seen as more rigorous or having higher standards or more scientific. But one of the sort of pinnacles of science is being able to have cumulative research. Being able to say, we have a bunch of different studies, we can put it together, we can say something about this phenomenon, right? But when you do your research like this, it really is impossible. And so I like to point out the ways in which the quantitative research we do has sort of the veneer of being very rigorous, but often is not. And that's true for qualitative research too. I'm not criticizing just quantitative. But it can sort of see, if I put up something like this, this looks like very strong evidence. But this construct here is actually a blend of several of these. Right? So it's not specific. It's not just one of those. It's kind of a synthesis of multiple. Right? So what looks like very clear and strong evidence, once you start looking a little closer, starts to break down a little bit. Right? You start questioning, well, what do we really know about this? The other problem, and this is really the problem that motivated me, so I started doing mixed methods in my doctoral program as a doctoral student. I did my PhD at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and they were very open about mixed methods there. So all the professors were doing mixed methods research, they did it part of our training, it was part of our thinking. My first project that I did in my first year, though, was a quantitative project. And ultimately what I had by the end of that project was something like looks like this. Exploration equals 2.75, commitment equals 3.50. What does that mean? Right? It's a 4-point scale, so people are more committed than they are exploring. But I want to know what those numbers meant. I wanted to actually know, as a psychologist, the reason I became a psychologist, I should say, I'm not a clinical psychologist. In the US, we use that term psychologist more broadly than you do in Sweden. I'm a developmentalist, not clinical. But as someone who studies psychology, the reason I got into it is because I wanted to understand people. Right? I wanted to understand people and their experiences and their context and what makes them unique and what makes them similar and all those kinds of things. But this doesn't do it. Getting a number on a scale doesn't tell me that. Right? So that was my initial crisis of sort of, I did a project and I got those results and I thought, I can't learn anything by doing this. Of course I've changed. Now I know I can learn some things from this. But at the time I sort of felt like I can't learn anything from this. So I need to do some qualitative research. Okay. So that brings me to part 2, which is the brief overview of mixed methods research. And I'm actually on time. This is pretty good. So all of that was meant to be background. You have to keep it in your brain, because for part 3, all of those concepts will come back. as I integrate these. But now this is really just a step back and me talking about how I view and use mixed methods. Hopefully something in here is useful to you or might resonate. You might not agree with everything. But a little bit about what I mean by this and why I do it. So first is broadly in the research world, this is true in almost every discipline, there are these worldviews or paradigms that are often in shorthand used as quantitative and qualitative. Right? Sometimes they're aligned with quantitative is a post-positivistic perspective and qualitative is a constructivist perspective. Those methods and worldviews don't actually line up perfectly like that, but that's often the way they're treated. Right? So if you're doing qualitative work, you're doing constructivist research. If you're doing quantitative work, you're doing positivistic research. So these are paradigms that have really governed a lot of the research in many disciplines for decades. During the 70s and 80s, there were what were called the paradigm wars. People are familiar with the paradigm wars? I don't know. There was a lot of discussion about basically which one of these is the proper way to be doing research. And it got very vicious, where these camps sort of really started to build, where if you do qualitative research, you have to completely reject quantitative and vice versa. And I think we're still living with the remnants of all of that now, that it got very heated and people still have quite strong opinions about that. But out of those paradigm wars, a third paradigm was proposed, which is the pragmatic view. And the pragmatic view is that we don't need to align methodologies with sort of worldviews so tightly. What we should use as our driving force for the work we do is our research question. Right? You start with your research question, and then you figure out what methodology makes the most sense for that research question. Right? So in a pragmatic view, qualitative and quantitative, they're just methodological tools. They're tools that you use to address a particular question. And if you don't think from a research question perspective first, and you say, I am a quantitative researcher, or I am a qualitative researcher, then that will impact the type of question you're willing to ask. Right? That means the worldview, or the methodology really, because it's not always coherently aligned with the worldview, but the methodology that you're invested in actually impacts your research question. And I guess some could argue that that's okay, but personally, I don't see that as ideal, because it restricts the types of questions that we ask. So from a pragmatic perspective, you state your research question first, and then you figure out what it is, how it is you would investigate that question. When I talk to doctoral students or even undergraduate students, and they come to my office and they want to talk about the research that they're interested in, what they always talk about is methods. Right? They talk about methods. Oh, I want to do a structural equation model of this sort of thing. Or I want to do a grounded theory analysis of this. And the hardest question you can ask a student, or actually many researchers, is, what's your research question? Right? Every time they go, oh, that's a good question. What is my research question? And I mean, I'm guilty of this too at times. Like, you sort of move forward thinking you're going to do something without stopping and thinking, what is your research question? And so an activity I often have people do is just write out a bunch of research questions that are interesting to you. That's where you should start. Write out research questions, then start sorting them and seeing how they fit together. Some of them are going to be on the same theme, some are going to be different, some can be sub-questions of a broader question. But you need to spend more time thinking about the questions, completely independent of the methodology. I have one doctoral student right now who just cannot stop integrating these, and every time she comes to my office, she starts talking about methods. I say, no, I will not listen, nothing about methods. Stop. Because if you have them intertwined, it just becomes very difficult. The method starts driving the question. And really, we want to be question-focused. So obviously, I'm really rigid about this. That's because I firmly believe in this perspective. Not everybody does. Right? So you'd have a different perspective on these things if you didn't take a pragmatic view. But if you take a pragmatic view, then you'll be completely open to any methodology, whatever it is that addresses that particular question. So, in our work we use focus groups, we use individual interviews, we use observations, we use surveys, we do experiments, we do longitudinal studies, cross-sectional, whatever, right? Whatever it is that addresses the question. That can be done within the resources we have, of course. But you have to be willing to do all those kinds of things. More substantively, there are several rationales, more specific rationales, for why you might want to use both qualitative and quantitative methods, both. So I should say, coming back here, from this perspective, it's not, this needs to be clear because sometimes people don't understand this. It's not that you always use both, right? Mixed methods researchers usually, or people who are proponents of mixed methods, don't argue that you need to do qualitative and quantitative. It's that you need to be open to all possible methods. So that means sometimes only doing quantitative studies, sometimes only doing qualitative studies, and sometimes doing both. So it depends on what the nature of your question is, right? Being open. And so we talk about what's called a mixed methods program of research. So that's how I characterize the work that I do. If you look at all of my research, it sort of fits within this mixed methods idea, because some are completely one or the other or a little bit of both. But you take it all together and it's sort of a mixed methods way of thinking.
Can I ask
Yeah,
something?
of course.
When you talk about mixed methods, is it always a combination of quantitative and qualitative, or can it be like two types of qualitative methods?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think there's a lot of disagreement about that. As sort of mixed methods has been coming sort of to its own field now, there's a lot of discussions about these kinds of issues, or what counts as mixed methods. There's a journal of mixed methods research. Has anyone ever seen that before? It's been out maybe 15 years now, but it's a journal that's actually mostly focused on methodological issues in mixed methods research. So it's a whole, just like there are qualitative methodologists and quantitative methodologists, now there are mixed methodologists, and they have their own journal they publish in. So they debate these kinds of things. And just like with any, think about your own area, there are always debates and camps, and there are people who are sort of the purists who only believe, no, it must be this way, and there are the flexible people who say, well, it could be this or it could be that. So it really just depends. Some of the work, I'm not going to talk about this later. I do quantitative and qualitative analysis of the same data. So take qualitative data, some like narrative data, for example, a bunch of stories. You have hundreds of stories, and then code them and turn them into quantitative data and put them into some quantitative models. That's quantitative research, right? But then go back to the original narratives and do some qualitative analysis of those narratives and put those together in one paper. So it's mixed methods, but it's the same data source. But some mixed methods people would say that's not really mixed methods research. I say it is, but I'm more flexible. So there's no good answer. I think you should call it whatever you want to, if you want.
I just thought it's good to know if I want to label myself as a pragmatic or mixed methods researcher.
Yeah. So sometimes there's a distinction between mixed methods and multiple methods. That's where that distinction is. So multiple methods is more like what you're talking about, if you have multiple quantitative methods or multiple qualitative methods. It goes back to the old Campbell and Fisk multi-trait, multi-method matrix, if you're familiar, if any of you know psychometrics. That's from the 50s. That basically, if you really want to understand your construct well, you should be using multiple methods in multiple different ways, so you get sort of this triangulation. But yeah, there's debates.
Oh, thank you.
So there are several reasons why you might use mixed methods research. One, and to me this is sort of the weakest rationale, but it is a rationale, is a need to enhance the study. You just sort of, sometimes, like I said, when I got those results of expiration is 2.75 and commitment is 3.50, I just didn't feel like that was enough, right? I felt like I wasn't learning enough. So I just needed more. I needed something deeper to be able to understand my data. And so I was really feeling like I just needed to enhance the study. It needed something extra. I give this example all the time. It's an American example, but it really highlights where this can be useful to be using mixed methods. It was back in 2009 when Barack Obama first became president. He was trying to change healthcare in the US, right? He was trying to get universal healthcare. And the way he approached that, the way he was trying to convince the American people that this was a good idea, was by pummeling them with data about how many people are uninsured, about how much it costs everybody, how many people die every year because they are uninsured. It was all these statistics. So he took the approach that if I just give them all the statistics, they'll be convinced that this is the way to go. So he was taking a quantitative approach, right? But he was criticized that he should have been, and he started doing this later, he should have been telling individual people's stories, right? He should have brought in a specific person who was denied coverage because of a pre-existing condition and went into debt, and telling the personal stories so that people can connect to those stories. And that's oftentimes in sort of policy relevant areas, it can be quite useful to have both quantitative and qualitative data. Because when you're speaking to non-academic audiences, you never really know what it is that they'll latch onto or what will be convincing to them. So if you can include both the quantitative data and the qualitative data, you're sort of speaking most broadly to the room. Ultimately, whether or not Obama was successful is kind of a mixed bag. Another topic, political scientists can talk about that. So that's sort of needing to enhance, like you sort of need more substance to it. A more specific one is needing to explain quantitative findings. And this is counterintuitive for some people because they don't think of qualitative research as being able to explain. Some people don't think of it that way. But often, whenever you do a quantitative study, almost you read a discussion section of any article that's quantitative, and it's filled with questions. Right? We don't understand why we got these results. We don't understand what they mean. Everyone speculates, but really it's question, it's speculation. Why are these two things related? Why did we get these results? Could it be of this mechanism? Might there be this moderator? Could it be different for these groups? Right? So following that up with a qualitative study can help you explain those results, actually. So whatever questions came out of the quantitative study, design a qualitative study around those questions. And so you can get deeper sort of information about what is going on. This is considered best practice now for randomized controlled trials in the US for any kind of intervention that you might do, which are always quantitative. Even if you find a successful trial, so whatever your intervention is, that it worked the way you thought it was going to work, it doesn't work for everybody. Right? There's always some variations, or you don't know why it worked. So that's a question of moderation. Is there a moderator present? Or mediator? Is there some mechanism that you don't understand? And so now the federal government actually considers it best practice to do a mixed method study of any RCT. So you do your randomized controlled trial, and then you do a qualitative component to follow that up. So you can try to understand why did it work for some people and not others, and what might the active mechanism be. So you really can, if you design it so the qualitative study is specifically targeting questions from the quantitative, so it's sequential, right? Then you can get some good answers about what might be going on. The third rationale is the opposite direction. Sometimes you just don't know anything about a topic, right? You know very little. You need to explore. You need to better understand the context. And so you should explore qualitatively. You start with a qualitative study. If you say, I know nothing about this topic, it makes a lot of sense to explore qualitatively. After you do that, if you want to, you could use that qualitative exploration to then do a quantitative study that's much larger based on what you learned from the qualitative study. This is considered best practice in, for example, scale development. So if you want to create a scale or a measure of some kind for some psychological construct, it makes a lot of sense to have focus groups or do interviews about your potential scale content. If I wanted to create a new scale of ethnic identity, for example, it would be wise potentially for me to talk to people about how do they think about their ethnicity, what does it mean to them, how do they conceptualize it, and then use that to create items that can then be part of a measure and then go through the scale validation from there. And again, that was recommended as the gold star way to create psychological measures in the 1950s. And at some point, people just kind of forgot about the qualitative part and then just started writing items and then using that. There are still people who do the qualitative component, but that's been pushed aside a little bit. So there's more mixed methods sort of in the history, at least within psychology, that has often been sort of forgotten. But that's a great example when you need to explore. Alternatively, maybe sometimes you're in a situation where you need to generalize. A lot of qualitative researchers actually say they don't want to generalize. That's not the goal of their work, and so that's fine. But sometimes you do qualitative research and you do want to generalize. You do a qualitative study of student success and you want to be able to say something more broadly than just your sample of 15 or 20 people. And so then if you want to generalize, it makes sense to scale up and then subsequently do a quantitative study. And then finally, it can be useful for when there's a need for cultural adaptation or cultural sensitivity. So if you suspect that your measure or your intervention or whatever it might be may not work for all cultural groups, that would be a good candidate to do a qualitative study to investigate why, in what ways it may or may not be applicable. Scratching. So this is cultural adaptations of interventions. That's a really big thing in the US right now because a lot of interventions that exist are done on a very sort of small population, a specific population. And so then it's unclear, does the intervention work with other people? So this was the case for a long time. All the intervention research was really done on white college-aged males. And so the National Institutes of Health has like the inclusion criteria now. So if you don't have 50-50 men and women, you have to explain why. If you don't intentionally enroll ethnic minorities, you have to explain why, right? So, but then by having more diversity in your samples, you have to think more about the cultural adaptations. How much does the original intervention actually apply to these different groups, or are there some differences? For example, my colleague Rich Lee, who's in my department, he does parenting interventions, so sort of interventions to help train parents to interact better with their children. For some parents it's very natural, and for others it's not as much. They need some assistance, and it's rooted in particular evidence-based models. But what they found is that a lot of that doesn't apply for some immigrant and refugee communities in Minnesota. They think they're coming from a different place of thinking about parenting and what the role of parents is. And so if you bring the model that's based on, American white middle class parents and try to deploy it with among refugees, it's just not going to work because they have a totally different frame of reference. And so they do a lot of qualitative research about cultural adaptations, thinking about how would we modify potentially this, so that the same intervention can just be modified to apply to a different group. Okay, almost last thing before we take a little break. Thinking more broadly about why mixed methods make sense, I think for me, or even qualitative research makes sense, is thinking about science more broadly. Some of you may not think of yourself as scientists. I don't know, you come from different disciplines. I don't really care if I'm a scientist or not, but I feel like I do science, right? So I sort of generally subscribe to this. And I think that these steps in science exist whether or not we personally believe in them, right? So there's 5 really fundamental steps in science that govern a lot of the research that we do, whether we realize it or not. So the first is, let's say we want to create a new science. We know nothing whatsoever, absolutely nothing about this topic. Okay, where would we start? What do you do first if you know nothing? What do you think you should do?
Can do different things, maybe read.
Read, that would be good, yeah.
Or go out and look for something.
Go out and look for something, exactly. Observation, right? We know nothing, we need to go observe, we need to go see what is happening. This is actually, for those of you who are developmental psychologists, it's very easy to see how this happened in developmental psychology. The early developmental psychology was exactly this, was observation. Late 1800s, early 1900s. What people were doing is just observing babies and then writing reports about them. They were called baby bios. Charles Darwin did one about his own son. There are a number of these, you can find them published. That's Jean Piaget did a lot of this, although he was doing it from it was later, so it wasn't fully an observation. But he really emphasized observation, that we need to just watch and see what kids do before we want to understand anything, right? So observation is a great first step. Once you observe a lot, you go out and you've observed for hours and hours and hours, and you feel like you really got a sense for what's going on. Then you want to sort of pull together some averages and say, well, what tends to happen, right? You start talking about description. How do I describe those observations? And again, in developmental psychology, you could see this around the early 1900s. There was a lot of description based on extensive observation. For example, on average, when do children walk? Anyone know?
It's different for different.
It varies a little bit, but there's still it's pretty tight around an average.
9 to 14 months?
Yeah, it's about 9 to 15 months and about a year mean. So that was good. There's the average and there's the range, right? How do we know that there's about that average and that range? Because we did a lot of observation, right? That's where that information comes from. So there's the, what's used in the US, the Bailey scale of infant motor development. I think it's used in other places too. It's this whole detail, the first 2 years of life of all the sort of motor milestones that infants engage in, and what the average is and what the normal range is. Right? So these are descriptions based on extensive observations. And then there's been research about the cultural variations in some of those. Most of them are not too extreme. So you engage in a lot of observation. You say, okay, this is what a child walks on average at 12 months. The next question that you'd want to ask, what do you think? You can say something happens. What do we want to know once we know something happens?
Why?
Why? Why does it happen? Explanation. Right? Trying to explain why we see these averages. Why do children on average walk at 12 months? Right? Once we're able to explain our phenomenon really well, this is where it gets a little bit harder. If we can explain it really well, we really know why babies walk at 12 months on average. What's the next step of what we would try to do? If we feel like we have an excellent explanation.
Predict.
Yeah, you know all these, this is good.
I have not seen.
You have not seen this, yeah. No, it's predictive. If we can explain it really well, then we should be able to predict when it happens. You should be able to go, if you see a baby, you see that baby will walk next week, right? If your predictive model is good, but your predictive model will only be good if you have a good explanation, which is based on extensive description, based on thorough observation. Okay? All right, the last step is the one that no one likes, makes them uncomfortable. Do you know what it is? We can predict it, so we know when something will happen. We know when the baby will walk. What do we want to do next? It has a sinister vibe to it, which is why no one likes it. We want to control it. If we can predict it, we know it's going to happen, then we want to be able to modify it or control it or have some sort of governance over it in some way. And if the idea of control as being the ultimate goal of science makes you uncomfortable, just think a little bit about what scientists do. Think about therapy, if anyone's a therapist. Therapy is fundamentally about control. It's about controlling behavior. Medication is about control. Right? Now, no disrespect to the therapists in the room, but our control isn't very good. Right? We can be successful in some contexts, but in general, it's not great. Medication that we use for psychological disorder, not great. Why is that? Because we can't predict it, because we can't explain it, we can hardly describe it, and we've sort of observed it. Right? So we tend to skip these steps a little bit. And we move to control very quickly, because this is where we want to be. Again, whether you might not feel this way internally, but that's kind of, if you're doing science, that's where we're going. So where psychology or related fields, where do you think we spend most of our time? What do we value in the research that you see? What do you think? What would the average study that you might read? This might vary because you're in different disciplines.
Well, I think at least in psychology, quantitative, it's all about predicting.
Mm-hmm. That's the idea, right? Do we do a very good job of that?
No, I mean there's small pieces of a puzzle that we don't
Yeah.
even know.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a strong interest in trying to do this kind of prediction, which is why quantitative is one reason is so favored. Where we spend most of our time is just trying to explain. Explanation and prediction get kind of conflated a little bit. They're not always clear which is which, and we use the language of prediction, right? But a lot of it is trying to explain. You know, the search for mediators and moderators and mechanisms is about explanations. Here is why this thing is happening. And so this is really, here on, is what is of most interest to a lot of psychologists and quantitative social scientists. Tend to be 3 down is what they're really interested in. So control, again, any intervention that you do, whether it's a medical intervention or some kind of health intervention or an educational intervention or whatever, any behavioral intervention is an attempt at control. That's what it is. And that kind of research is highly valued. Anything that's explanation and prediction oriented is highly valued. So quantitative research really emphasizes steps 3, 4, 5. But again, and I do plenty of quantitative research, I have a lot of respect for my colleagues who do even more of it, we don't do those things very well. We just don't. And the reason why is we don't do enough of those. Not enough observation, not enough explanation or description. And the reason why is these are going to be more qualitative approaches. You're going to need to make more use of qualitative data and qualitative analysis to observe and describe. And those are simply not valued within our field, within psychology and again, quantitative social sciences. It's a common, I try to do a lot of descriptive research because I think it's really important for these reasons. But it's a common comment that I get, and others do too who do similar research from journal editors when papers are rejected or by reviewers who don't like it. This is just descriptive, right? Just descriptive is a common, the just is always there. That's a value statement, right? You're just doing this and you're not doing this. You need to be doing at least this to be seen as doing sort of valuable science. But increasingly also, if any of you are familiar with what's going on within many fields, not just psychology, around the replicability crisis and the open science movement, there's been a lot of attention to the fact that we don't even understand what we're studying. Because we haven't done basic fundamental observation and description. So we spent all this time doing all these studies that turn out to be totally untrue. And in part because we never did the fundamental work to understand the context. A great example of this is research on, now I'm blocking on the name of it, ego depletion, if you're familiar with ego depletion. Ego depletion, I won't get into details, but it's something that maybe 5 years ago was considered like settled, robust. Everyone believed it in psychology. It was something that absolutely had strong empirical foundation. And now almost nobody believes that the concept even exists. Even though there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies supporting it, it turns out that all of those studies were built on questionable approaches and questionable methods. And part of the problem is nobody really knows what ego depletion actually even is. You look like you want to say something. Yeah, no, yeah, no.
No.
So this to me is an argument for mixed methods research, right? Or if not even an argument for mixed methods research, an argument for the place of qualitative research in social sciences. That we really need to, it's not only important, it's really foundational. It's where we get our foundational information, our foundational knowledge. And some people don't like that framing because they feel like, okay, you only need qualitative at the beginning and then you sort of get rid of it. And I'm certainly not taking that position, just that even if you are primarily a quantitatively oriented researcher, there's great value in what we can get qualitatively. That you can be a better quantitative researcher if you spend more time on steps 1 and 2. So I'll talk a little bit more about that after the break.
Can I just?
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Just
Yeah.
maybe if you work qualitative, you go
to another third one, maybe instead of explanation, you could go to interpretation.
Yeah,
Or,
right.
I mean, another step, so...
Yeah, so I was going to include this in here, but I decided not to because I thought I was getting too far afield, but it's sort of different modes of sort of inquiry. And so I think that starts to get into more of a humanistic mode, which is a little bit different from a scientific mode. And they can complement each other for sure, but when you start talking about interpretation, it starts to maybe get into a different, where this is not necessarily the goal. But absolutely, otherwise, I mean, I do agree with you that there has to be between, in here, there's some interpretation. I mean, you can say that that's a part of an explanation. The explanation has to come from the interpretation. So I would agree with that. Yeah, this is course. You can put lots of sub-steps if you want to in there. But yeah, Pete?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like identity and like ethnic identity.
Yeah.
And so if you were to observe it, because when I think about observation,
Yeah.
it's like what you can see, but I mean identity is supposed to be like in here as well. So,
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's a good question. Observation isn't necessarily just what you can see. So it's not just, you know, me going to the schoolyard and watching people play and say, okay, now I understand ethnic identity. But it's more interacting with people. So, I mean, you know, through interviewing,
yeah, but
you can access that
Yeah.
sort of, if you are a good interviewer, you know what questions to ask, you can get understandings from people that they themselves don't have. Right? So
Yeah.
that's a form of observation.
it's an observation through like asking and getting
Absolutely.
people
It's
to
not
talk.
completely a
It's not-
detached
no,
observation.
No, because it's not really natural. in
Yeah,
a-
right. It doesn't have to be natural,
No.
right? That's certainly a form,
Yeah.
but it also could be extracted observations. Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, the term, I wonder if there's a better term even than
Yeah.
observation. Because observation, it does give that sense that it's sort of this detached sort of way of it. No. I'd say almost any qualitative method has an observational component sort of built into it. But not necessarily. Okay?
Okay,
We'll
there
break.
should be fika.
Fika?
I saw Claudia running around.
How long do we? Okay, properly caffeinated now. Get through this last part. All right, let's see. Okay, so with those foundations there now in place, as I said, I want to talk about 3 insights on identity that I've had from doing mixed methods research. So these are examples of ways in which really, and I mean this is not just me sort of after the fact making this up, I really would never have done these projects or learned these things if I hadn't been doing mixed methods research. I don't think it would have happened, it would have been possible. So really going back to these rationales or types of problems, the examples I'm giving really fall mostly in this category of need to explore qualitatively. And actually in all of these cases, I wasn't necessarily even intending to explore on these topics. It was really just serendipitous. Is that a term people are familiar with? I don't know. Serendipity is like happened by accident, by chance, but it worked out. It was very fortunate that it worked out. So these are topics that I was exploring sort of other things, and then I noticed these, you know, I mean, that's the great thing about doing qualitative research, and those of you who do it know this quite well, that if you're asking about one thing, you learn about all kinds of other stuff that you didn't even ask, because people are interesting people and they start talking about their lives and you start learning all kinds of interesting details. And so those details can serve as seeds then for future research projects. And that's essentially, I have 3 stories of how that played out. Much of this is taken from this chapter that I wrote for a book. This chapter is linked on that page that I sent to you, so you can link directly to a PDF post-print version of this chapter if you're interested. So most of this is described in more detail there. So as I said, I had 3 insights, and I sort of labeled each one of the insights. So the first one, I don't anticipate they'll make sense until I describe them, just so you know, is not so fast times in the world of identity. So if you look at the identity development literature, there are all these terms that all suggest that something changes very quickly, right? Crisis, encounter, trigger, turning point, all of these suggest that our identities can sort of one day we see ourselves one way, and then that changes. And we now see ourselves a different way, that there's this sort of sudden kind of change, a sudden shift. And these terms are widespread throughout the identity development literature, and so I think it does give the impression that, that our identities are more malleable than we maybe otherwise think. The reality, though, that I've seen through doing this study, many studies, is that identity is a slow process. Right? It doesn't change quickly. There's not a trigger that all of a sudden just changes the way we think about who we are. So this is a quote from one qualitative study, and I'm not giving a lot of methodological details here. Again, you can see them all in the papers. All the papers are linked again. This is a quote from one student when she was age 18. This was in California. And she says, it gave me a broader perspective on what Filipinos are. She's talking about a course that she took. Because there's different people in there and different kinds of Filipino, and they all speak different languages, and just learning about the idea of Filipino is totally constructed. And that kind of made me feel better, because I was like, well, maybe realize that I really am Filipino. And my family really is Filipino, and I guess I never realized that. So this is just a quote about taking a course, and this course helped her realize that she's kind of Filipino. So this is that ethnic identity thing, that this maybe plays more of a role than she thought. So 2 years later, we follow up with her, and we did not ask her about this class 2 years later, but she spontaneously tells us, I took the class, Filipino Historical Dialogues, class I ended up teaching the next year, but it like changed my life, right? Because I've talked to so many people, and they all felt just as confused as I did, and they didn't know what a Filipino was either, and they didn't know if they counted because they were half, and just, I was like, wow, there's more people that feel the way as I do, weird, thought I was the only one. This question, or this answer, came in response to when we asked her about a turning point. So we asked about a turning point in your life, and this is what she told us, okay? 2 years prior, when she had this experience, she did not know this was a turning point, right? She did not know this was just sort of an interesting class, made her think a little bit, but she didn't say, at the moment that it was happening, she didn't say to herself, wow, this is a turning point for me. I've really changed the way I think. This has changed my life. Right? It wasn't until later that she's reflecting on that experience and has had some subsequent experiences that she can now look back 2 years prior and say, this was a turning point. Right? So this observation made me think about sort of the way we temporally manage our past experiences. That perhaps we tend to, we never experience change as it's happening, but only can see it, right, retrospectively, which makes sense that would be the case. But also these terms that suggest sort of something happening rapidly or quickly are just because of the way we, sort of a retrospective recall bias in how we construct our past. It's much easier to sort of say, this class changed my life, versus sort of talking about it as a more drawn-out, slow process that was a sequence of multiple steps. I mean, she even kind of alludes to that, saying, I ended up teaching it the next year, right? So there's just kind of this sequence. But it really suggested to me the importance of sort of the meaning-making process, or the qualitative, sort of cognitive process around how people make sense of their past experiences. And so what we decided to do quantitatively then is to go to a bunch of narratives. We have hundreds of these narratives, and essentially deconstruct them. We call this the narrative deconstruction project. You'll see it's still in prep because it's a slow process, just like identity. So we had all these narratives, very similar to Mary's story that she just told. And we broke it down into 3 domains, sort of emotional, behavioral responses, and the cognitive meaning. And looked at, was it largely at the time of the event, or was it sort of later? So when describing the story, were they describing these domains when the thing happened, or sort of down the road, like at a different time? Does that make sense? So we're separating out the domain and then the time scale, and looking to see how these tend to cluster. And they clustered exactly how we thought they would. Emotions tend to be centered at the time of the event. People were contextualizing their emotions at the time they experienced it. I should say, that's not necessarily the emotions they actually felt at the time, but that's how they're talking about it, as they're putting their emotions at the moment. They put their responses at the moment, so whatever they did, whatever behaviors they engaged in, they're in the event. But all of the meaning is later. It's detached, right? It comes later. And so it supports this idea that this meaning-making process, sort of the real substance, the interpretation, what we do with our experiences, is likely sort of ongoing and continually refined, right? It changes over time. It's not connected to the event itself. The meaning isn't linked directly to the event, but is sort of inspired by the event. And because it's not directly tied to the event, it might then be more malleable or more changeable, or might be more susceptible to be different over time. Our meanings are more flexible. And there are longitudinal studies that have shown that this is the case, that the meanings that people make of the same experience can change over time. Right? Think about any of your past experiences, and you know that this is probably true, right? The way you've thought about, especially negative experiences that you might have experienced in your life, some of them you really thought of as bad experiences that had a negative impact on your life, but maybe now you see them in some more positive light, or at least see the benefit of some of those experiences. So we're doing this with, we have 2,000 or so of these narratives. We haven't coded them all. We've done quite a lot, and we see this pattern showing up very consistently. And so you can see that again here, the process. The event happened, but then she talked about, she ended up teaching it. She talked to many people. There's sort of this continual sort of engagement. It's not just a singular event. So that way of thinking was not at all the way that I was thinking about how identity and memories work prior to just observing this process with her. It really was seeing, wow, okay, this is how this happens, and then doing a follow-up study to suggest that maybe that's actually the case. And we have some more studies planned to understand that even better. So that was my brief example. The other two are a little bit longer. The second one is the idea about context, social context. So contexts are cold and contexts are hot. Again, you have no idea what that means, and I don't expect you to know what that means. You might know, this came from cognition, cold and hot cognition. Are you familiar with this? Okay. So cold and hot cognition is a distinction that's made between cognitive processes like problem solving that we might engage in that is completely neutral. So like a neutral problem solving, we're given a problem solving task and you work through it, that doesn't have any kind of emotional or motivational consequences. That's cold cognition. Just like, can you do this problem? Hot cognition is, can you do this, or how well do you do this problem when there's a lot of emotional context, or the stakes are high, or there's more sort of behind it, right? So it's more like how our cognitive processes are potentially modified by our current mental state, right? That's what hot cognition gets into versus cold cognition. So I started to think about this in terms of context, so environments that people are engaged in. The sort of context can be cold and context can be hot. And a lot of this comes from a paper with Uva, actually, that we did, just recently was published, about thinking about ethnic and racial settings, so settings like diversity experiences that people have, and what influence might these settings have for their ethnic and racial identity development, which is a subject we continue to work through. So if you think about that in terms of cold and hot context, cold is this idea that we talk about of objective diversity. So if you want to know something about the diversity of a particular context, you just look at, the demographics of a neighborhood or a city. You could say Trollhättan is this many people from these different places, right? It's all sort of official records about what the diversity looks like. So you could say, what's a diversity in Sweden, by the way? Comes to mind.
Örebro.
Örebro. Okay, what's a non-diverse city or town? Anyone think of one that doesn't have a lot of diversity?
Somewhere in Skåne.
Somewhere in Skåne.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that's based on sort of who's there,
Yeah.
right? It's based on census data or official records or your own. Well, maybe. But generally, you could look at official records and say, okay, this place is very diverse and this place is not very diverse. That's cold context because it's totally neutral. It's just sort of, this is on paper what it looks like, right? Hot context, in contrast, is more the engagement with the diversity, both physically and psychologically. So I said it depends because someone else might say some parts of Skåne are quite diverse, right? So two people can disagree about the diversity of a particular context. As I said, I did my PhD work in Santa Cruz in California, and I was interviewing people in my first year there, and we're asking them, well, how diverse do you think Santa Cruz is? And some people said, not diverse at all. I've never seen so many white people in my life. Other people say, this is the most diverse place I've ever been. It's amazing, the diversity. They're talking about the same place. It's a small town, right? They all live in the same area. Santa Cruz is tiny. But they experienced it very, very differently. And related to earlier discussion, a lot of how they viewed it depended on where they were coming from previously, right? Sort of relative comparisons. But we know this is very similar to the distinction between ethnic labels and ethnic identity. I mean, you could say ethnic labels is almost like a cold ethnicity, and ethnic identity is hot ethnicity. That these kind of objective data like this can be useful and helpful, but they don't tell us how people are interacting with those environments, right? How they perceive it, what their interaction is. So one of the ways in which we look at this too is, again, through storytelling processes, how people tell stories about their past experiences. So how they talk about how they interact with their context, how they manage their environments. So, what are they talking about? Who do they talk to it about? What reason? Why are people engaging in storytelling? So what we have people do, this gets a little confusing. It's an approach my colleague Kate McLean pioneered, which is first you ask people to tell a story or write a story. We usually do written stories. So write a memory about a turning point or whatever it might be. After they do that, then we ask them, have you ever told this story to anybody else? And many people have not actually told their stories the first time they're telling it to us. If they say yes, then we ask them, tell a story about when you told this story to somebody else. Right, so it's a little meta. So they're telling a story about telling the story. So this is why we say it's storytelling, because it's a story about when they talk to somebody else about it. And these were all diversity-related narratives, so it was about times that they felt aware of their ethnicity. And so we want to know, who do they talk to about their ethnicity-related experiences, if at all? I think in this study it was 40% of them hadn't told anybody, which is quite a lot. So this is we're trying to understand the hot context, right? If their experiences with diversity, their own subjective experience, and then how they interact with their environments with those experiences. Do they keep them in? Do they tell them to other people? If they tell them to other people, who do they tell them to? And why do they tell them these things, right? So we can look at a simple chart here. What they say, to whom, and for what reason. And we saw two very interesting pathways. First is this one. Stories of prejudice, so some story about experiencing discrimination, unfair treatment, racism, whatever, which are very common stories that people tell. Usually about half stories are about this. Those stories were most often told to peers. These were first-year university students, so 18-year-olds. Mostly told to peers. Okay? And told for the purpose of emotion regulation. So they experience something negative, someone targets them because of their ethnicity, they go to one of their friends, and they talk to them about it to try to cool down and sort of deal with their emotions. Right? So this is kind of a pathway of how this experience might be navigated. They're having the experience, and this is how they socially navigate it. Another pathway we saw was these experiences of learning about culture. So they might have taken a class or attending an event or something where they learned about their cultural background. So it's something a little bit more positive, right? Not a negative experience of discrimination. Those are told by their parents instead, largely for the purpose of just sharing life experiences. Sort of like, I want my parents to know what I've done, what I've learned. So it's kind of for intimacy, it could be. So these were two pathways that really, when we observe these narratively, these are based on narratives, but really got us thinking quite a bit. In particular, related to what I said earlier, there's this concept of parental cultural socialization, right? How parents engage in the process of teaching their kids about their cultural background. And there's extensive research on this, and it mostly is an adaptive process that's useful for parents to engage in this. And there are two broad types, racial socialization and ethnic socialization. So ethnic socialization is when parents talk to their kids about their ethnic heritage. So things about language, food, celebrations, customs, all those kinds of sort of national ethnic heritage kind of things. That's ethnic socialization. Racial socialization is actually quite a distinct process. These tend not to be correlated with one another. So if parents engage in one, they don't necessarily do the other. Racial socialization is when parents talk to their kids about what it means to be a minority in a particular environment. So things like, and letting them know that they might experience discrimination, that people might treat them unfairly, that people might expect less of them. This particularly came from African American psychology, where this is a really big kind of thing. A component there is how to interact with the police, that the police might treat you in a particular way. Right, so it has nothing to do with ethnicity. There's nothing about their heritage. It's all about race and how you might be treated, right? So these two components tend to be not correlated for most parents. Really interesting, my colleague Rich Lee, again, I mentioned him before, he does research on, in Minnesota we have this peculiarity, we have a very large population of transracial, transnational adoptees from Korea. So they're white Minnesotan parents who adopted babies from Korea. Chances are very high if you are in Minnesota and you meet someone who's Korean American, and especially if it's a woman, that she's adopted. It's just it has to do with where the agencies are located or whatever, just a large population there. So what Rich studies is how do parents socialize their kids to cultures that they don't share? Right, it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
How do white parents, American parents, socialize their children to be Korean? Because they're Korean. They grow up in America, but they have Korean heritage. What he found is that they actually do an okay job with the ethnic socialization. They go out of their way to try to learn some things and help their kids. They have these Korean culture camps in Minnesota you can go to and learn about Korean culture and things like that. So they do that okay. They don't do this at all, racial socialization. They do not talk to their kids about what it means to be have minority status in the U.S. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, this is a little confusing.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. I agree.
So white parents, American parents, adopt Korean babies.
That's right.
It's a baby, so it doesn't have an ethnic heritage. The only thing that differentiates that baby from other baby in the U.S. is the race.
Right.
So however you socialize them into a Korean heritage, that's actually racial socialization.
It would be that way sort of if you paid no attention to the American context. So in the US context, there's sort of this general press or expectation that ethnic minorities will have some connection or knowledge of their cultural ancestry. And so what happens is with ethnic socialization, you have this, we see this all the time, again, this is the useful utility of doing interviews and observation, is Korean American adoptees who talk about wanting to learn more about their heritage background. They want to learn more about their Koreanness because it's part of their heritage, it's part of their ancestry. And that's an American sort of, I don't know if it's limited to the US, but it's certainly present there, where there's ethnic minorities, because largely in the school system we learn about Western Europe and the US, not other places. And so there's this desire to learn more about what their background and history is. And so wanting to know more about their cultural history, but also their personal history.
And it also means so much more. I told this story earlier today because I spend a lot of, I visited Moines so many times, and every time I come to Minnesota and I say I'm from Sweden, a lot of people say, oh, I'm Swedish too. And I was like, oh, are you? And then when we start to talk, they never been to Sweden.
Yeah.
They don't speak a word. But their great-great-great-grandfather was from Sweden. But they still say, I'm Swedish.
Oh, yeah.
And it means a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, if your great-great-great-parents were Swedish and then your parents are their children, somehow in the household you're exposed to something. I mean, the food maybe, or...
Yeah, there's some of that, yeah.
Yeah, with something,
yeah.
you're exposed to something Swedish. But if you're adopted, taken as a baby, adopted by American parents, you have been exposed to nothing.
Right. But that's what they want. So they want the exposure because they weren't given it. And they're known. So, I mean, you can separate these two, but they also can often go together. So the racial, it gets a little confusing. the racial context of the US actually makes the importance of ethnicity. Because the adopted Korean American kids are treated differently. Like they know that they're not like others. And so then they want to learn more about the source of that difference. And so then there's more of a desire for the ethnic socialization and the parents do it.
Yeah, I think it's still connected.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't artificially separate them, but we know that some parents, just because they do one of these, they might not do the other in terms of how they talk to their kids.
I mean, what I mean is, if there was no racial context,
Yeah.
if people would not have
Yeah,
treated
I know,
them
but there is a
differently
racial
because of
context.
their race, yeah, they wouldn't want the ethnic socialization.
No, that's what I'm saying. The racial context is what gives rise to
Yeah,
the need for that.
exactly.
Yeah, so they're related in that sense, yeah. But we can separate them because we don't like to think about things at a societal level in the US. We think of things only on a personal level. It's very common. Yeah,
I'm not that good in English.
That's
so
okay,
I'll
yeah.
just try. But
I'm not that good in
has-
Swedish, so.
So has studies been done comparing? Because my idea that in Sweden, if someone adopts a child, it's not that big focus in giving them their ethnic socialization. So has studies been done to compare? Because you said they want this,
Yeah, right.
the adopted children.
It's often driven by the
But have you
children.
compared if this is just something that the society wants?
Right.
Because there are big differences in how our society and the US
Right.
looks at race and
Yeah,
ethnicity.
definitely.
Can you see differences in how the identity is like produced or developed? Comparing, do you understand my
Yeah. No, I definitely understand. So I think the probably best comparison is sort of in why, again, the racial context is important for understanding why ethnic is important, is if you look at the studies that have been done with transnational adoptees, so white American parents adopting from, for example, Eastern Europe, you don't see the same process because even if you're, especially as a baby, then they wouldn't have an accent and their name wouldn't be recognizable, or they wouldn't be treated as different. They'd be treated as American. So that's the racial context. So then you don't have the same engagement, ethnic socialization. You don't have the same engagement or the need from the children wanting it, although they might when they're older. Because there's a lot of, especially now with more access to information, ancestry, and DNA, there's a lot of searching for birth parents and things like that. But that's an example where even within the US, you don't see it's the same. It really is racialized. Because if you sort of look white and your parents are white, then it's not problematic in the same way. Does that sort of address? Yeah, okay.
And there are similar studies in Sweden.
Yeah.
Are there comparing?
Well, not comparing, but
Oh, okay.
showing the
Yeah,
same.
I must look into it.
I must only say
Yeah.
something. It feels very strange that you give it such a big focus because in some way you are focusing on the differences and that's it's something other, that you are something other than than a white American.
Right.
Isn't that
I should say it's not me who's doing that.
I think it's very hard to understand why
Yeah.
you're putting a focus on it, and it's
Yeah.
like you say, is it really the children or the adolescents who wants this, or is
Yeah.
it something that I think it's hard to.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
guess we react this strongly because our society is really about taking away the differences and trying to look at the person and not like what's your race in the first place. So yeah, we have to try to.
It is, yeah, you can't, and that's one thing we were talking about earlier. I've really enjoyed my international collaborations to see these differences because a lot of my American colleagues who do this kind of research, and I used to be this way too, thought that all of this was this probably happens everywhere. It's the same, right? Because that's the way we tend to think, that everything is the same everywhere. And I know quite well that it's very different in places like Sweden and also in Germany, which is where I have collaborations as well, that it doesn't look the same. But the US context is so racialized. I mean, race is such a huge part of just everyday existence that it's not the case that if we just stopped talking about it, it would no longer be an issue. It's an issue whether people talk about it or not, and that we need to talk about it in a positive way and think about it in a positive way, which isn't just about emphasizing differences, it's also about emphasizing similarities, but acknowledging where differences do exist and differences in the experiences that people have, because they are quite different. Because society treats people, U.S. society, you are not treated the same based on how you look. I mean, that's very well documented. And so there's different psychological processes that go along with that.
But we see that in the Swedish data as well. If
Yeah.
you don't look Swedish, you will get questions
Yes.
about it.
Yeah.
And then this otherness might come from other people.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's more hidden in Sweden. It's not that clear.
It's not talked about at the higher sort of
That's
societal
right.
levels.
I
Yeah.
think
Right.
we want to be the good people, and and we want to treat everybody the same, but in the end, it is not like that.
Yeah, this is again the utility of hearing from people themselves, because as Ilva said, you see it quite clearly in the narratives. We weren't even asking about.
I understand that, but I think that I know that you're asked that even if you just say your name, they say, "Oh, that's a strange name. Where are you from?" But I think about this, not that you give it. I don't know how to explain it. That you not just say, you could say that, well, I'm adopted from Korea, and then it's nothing more. It's just the explanation why you look like you look, but you don't learn from your parents what your ethnic socialization are. You just learn that I'm born in another country by other parents who look more like me, and it's more like no value in that. It's that's why you look where you look. So that's why I just think I have to think about this a little more. I have never thought about it.
I think part of it is it's not just about how you look, because it's also about how you participate and are represented in the broader culture. And so it's that I look different, and when I look at the school, what I'm learning, or politicians, or cultural products, I'm also not represented in that. So there's a question of sort of how do I fit? Where is my place in this world? Because people treat me like I'm different, and I don't see myself. Our country is very diverse and talks about race a lot, but is not a representational democracy, right? The people who sort of run the country, not just politicians, but cultural intellectuals and all that kind of stuff, are disproportionately from white Western European backgrounds, right? So it's not representing the people. And so there's just a feeling of, who am I, and how, it goes back to the questions I was asking you before. How do you link sort of your personal past to who you are in the present? And for adoptees, that's an issue in general to think about when they're aware of their adoption status. But especially in an international context and or in a racialized context, they have to think about how does my, there's what's called birth thoughts rumination that sort of occurs. So thinking about what alternate lives might I have had if I hadn't been adopted. And part of what helps sort of seal that off is by learning more about their cultural background, and for many of them visiting Korea, even if they don't find birth family, just sort of feeling like they have more of a connection, that they understand where they came from. It's about understanding the past. Even if they came when they were very young and have no memory of any of that. There's just a need when you're in a society and you feel like you already are excluded from that society, and then you were taken from a different society, it's a very difficult way to find your place. So, but yes, it's very complicated. I agree. So, where were we? We're running low on time, which is fine. I don't have to finish. I'll just finish off this example and then we can stop. So there are these two different socialization practices that make a lot of sense in the U.S. context. And then supposedly these are related to ethnic identity development, right? So these are engaging in these processes help individuals understand their ethnic identities better. So when coming back to this, if you remember this, what I noticed based on these narratives, it seemed like peers were being used actually for racial socialization, talking about discrimination and things like that was sort of more associated with peers, whereas parents were more associated maybe with the cultural socialization. And so I looked back at the literature more carefully and basically saw there was nothing on peer socialization at all. It was all from parents. Nothing about how kids talk to one another. And these are, my interest is in sort of basically 16 to 30. No research at all about peer cultural socialization. And yet, from these data, we could see quite clearly, and we saw this in some other studies as well, there were several studies we did that all sort of pointed in the same direction, that they were definitely using their peers for racial experiences much more often, and were less likely to talk to their parents about it, in part because from other studies, they didn't want to worry their parents so much, or that they didn't want their parents to think they were being treated unfairly or having negative experiences. They sort of protect their parents, actually, from their own negative experiences. So it got us thinking a little bit whether there might be these sort of different pathways, that maybe there's a model that looks kind of like this, where if you have parent ethnic and racial and peer ethnic and racial predicting ethnic identity, that the parent ethnic will predict these two, but the peer racial would predict these two. So based on the qualitative data, and again, there were multiple studies, I'm just showing you the one, we thought, this is a sensible quantitative model based on what we have observed. Would we see this if we actually tested this quantitatively? So this is all based on observations from qualitative data. This is briefly just to show there were 4 samples of 18-year-olds. So we replicated the study 4 times, exactly the same way, looked over multiple samples. And we tested this model again. So we tested the model 4 times, 4 different samples, and then took a meta-analytic estimate of the 4. So it's basically an average of the 4. So it's a good estimate of the associations. And the results look like this. It supported the model. The difference in size has to do with how strong the paths were. So the parent ethnic socialization were stronger, thicker lines. The peer racial socialization were reliable, but a little bit weaker. So we did find evidence that perfectly mapped on to what we saw narratively was confirmed using these 4 samples in a quantitative model. We investigated all possible paths, and we also found that parent racial socialization was actually negatively related to ethnic identity, which is why they're in red. So the other ones were all positive, but parents' racial socialization was negatively associated. This is one of those why might this be? We're doing another now qualitative study to follow up on why this is the case would be incredibly useful. And we actually have qualitative data from all these people, we just haven't analyzed those data yet. So this is an example, and this does not happen very often, where something that we observed qualitatively was then tested quantitatively and almost 100% supported based on our observations. And so before this, this was just published. It was the first study that had measures of peer ethnic and racial socialization in it to go along with parents. And so it clearly showed that there's a sort of different channeling. So if we're thinking about socialization broadly, we can't just look at parents. That we have to look at peers also, and we should look at others as well, like teachers, media, socialization. Once you get into socialization, there are many, many agents that we could be examining. But it definitely suggests that there are these different sort of pathways. So we're almost at 3, so I'll just stop there and not give you my final example. You can read it in the article if you're very interested. But we have 30 seconds for questions.
Maybe I can.
Yeah, of course.
I'm sorry. Have you made any observations or studies about young people or young adults and seeing if some of them present themselves and see their identities as dual or as mixed? Because I can imagine that there are many young people who are raised up in a certain society, who is not their parents' original society, and then they see themselves in 2 ways, I think. And it would be interesting to read about that kind of.
Well, you're in luck because we have articles about that topic. Even in Sweden, that's one of, there's a couple articles about that. So we can share those with you.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of research about that in the US and Canada in particular, about being bicultural.
Yeah.
So it's the idea that, you identify with multiple sort of, so, I'm feeling very American, but also feeling very Chinese, and you have both of those. And there's quite a lot of research on that topic. And it consistently shows that dual identification like that is the most adaptive for young people. That's the most positive way to configure your identity. So if, for example, if you look at Chinese immigrants or Chinese Americans who were born in the US, but the parents of children of immigrants, if they just identify as American or just identify as Chinese, they're doing less well than if they identify as both.
Oh, that's really interesting to know.
And so the work we've done in Sweden hasn't been looking at adjustment, but more just, again, going back to observation, description, just do people think that way here? And the answer is absolutely yes.
Yes, I can send you a study that we
please do.
yes,
thank you.
about exactly that, and it's a bit different, I think, because a lot of people feel in Sweden that it's not accepted to be both.
Yeah.
They feel pressure sort of to choose, and when they say that they're both, they get questions about that, and they sort of feel that their identities are denied.
Yeah, and they maybe want to belong to two groups, but they are, as you said, questioned, and then maybe they feel that, I should choose.
Yeah, exactly.
Make my
That's what we
choice.
see. Yeah.
There's this weird, sort of ironic misalignment in the US and Sweden between society and self. So in the US, it's a strong assimilationist model. So the idea that you're supposed to completely shed ties, not have this dual identification. You come to the US, you're American, you speak English, you do nothing else, right? That's sort of the cultural message. And yet we have this strong custom of people identifying with dual, sort of rejecting that, and that it's actually positive, despite the fact that society is saying do this, it's actually more adaptive for them to do both. In contrast, Sweden has a stronger emphasis on, well, you can do both, as long as you're doing the Swedish part, it's fine to do the other part too, which is totally fine, right? So societally, the message is more like, yeah, do both, but then the young people don't have the language or the ability to do both. So they're not lined up right, which is kind of interesting why that is. And it's something to explore. I think we haven't really talked about that much, but why that disconnect? And so why is it in Sweden where they, at least officially, there's support to be bicultural, but people themselves feel like they can't be? So what is it about the messages or the policies or whatever that doesn't support that? But then in contrast, in the US, why is it that the messages are saying that you can't, and then all these people are doing it, and it's positive for them to do so?
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's 3:03. Everyone has other things to do.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for coming.